Every single time you pull up to a gas pump and squeeze that heavy handle, there is a totally invisible system actively working against you. It is not illegal. It is not some broken mechanical part that desperately needs a factory recall. It is just raw physics and your own daily behavior being used quietly to totally drain your wallet. Most guys standing at the pump staring at those digital numbers spinning higher and higher genuinely think their fuel costs are completely out of their control. They blindly blame the economy. They blame the heavy winter blend gasoline, or they just figure their engine is getting old and naturally burning more gas. But here is the absolute brutal reality of the automotive world. I see it in my repair bay constantly. You can take two guys, put them in the exact same make and model car, have them drive the exact same daily commute every single week, and one of them is going to spend up to 40% more on fuel. And the absolute craziest part is, the guy actively burning through an extra tank of gas every single month will have absolutely no idea it is happening. He is not driving any harder. He hasn't changed his route. He is just silently bleeding cash at the pump because of a string of choices sitting right in his driveway. Guys will literally spend entire weekends trying to chase down this totally invisible fuel economy problem. They will aggressively rip their intake manifolds off to clean their fuel injectors. They will spend hundreds of dollars replacing perfectly good oxygen sensors. They will dump heavy chemical cleaners into their gas tank hoping for a magical fix. They rebuild the top end of the motor, they do a massive tune-up, and they get back on the highway only to quickly realize they are still getting totally terrible mileage. They instantly blame the engine, entirely convinced the manufacturer built a gas-guzzling piece of junk. But the heavy metal block is doing exactly what it was engineered to do. Before we completely tear apart exactly how you are violently throwing your money away, you have to understand the physical reality of what sits under your hood. Your engine doesn't just run on raw liquid fuel. It runs on a highly precise, tightly controlled balance of air, fuel, physical temperature, and intense compression. The massive metal block is entirely managed by an engine control unit, the computer that constantly adjusts that exact balance thousands of times a minute. When anything physically disrupts that fragile balance, like restricted airflow, sloppy combustion timing, or heavy internal mechanical resistance, that highly sensitive computer heavily compensates. It completely panics, and it instantly commands the fuel injectors to aggressively spray significantly more liquid gasoline into the cylinder just to keep the entire system from stalling out. That is exactly where the hidden losses violently start. Let's look straight at the absolute biggest invisible parasite draining your tank: micro-resistance inside the engine block. Inside that heavy cast iron and aluminum structure, you have dozens of heavy metal components violently moving at incredible speeds. You have pistons forcefully dragging up and down, a heavy steel crankshaft violently spinning, and tight valve train components aggressively hammering open and closed. If the internal physical resistance against those heavy moving parts increases even a microscopic fraction, your engine has to physically burn noticeably more fuel just to overcome the raw drag. What actively causes that heavy internal friction? It comes entirely down to the specific fluid you decided to pour into the crankcase. Millions of drivers confidently buy cheap, highly refined crude oils that they blindly think are true lab-engineered synthetics. When those cheap, discount fluids get heavily subjected to the intense, localized heat of a modern combustion chamber, they physically thin out and entirely fail. The protective hydrodynamic wedge completely collapses, and raw steel physically scrapes against soft aluminum. You are actively robbing your own engine of natural efficiency because the internal components are suffering from heavy mechanical drag. I had a younger guy bring a fast little turbo car into the shop last year, and he had been strictly buying cheap discount oil. When we tore it down, the inside of his heavy metal turbo feed line was entirely choked with hard, black sludge. Because of that, the turbocharger was physically fighting against massive internal friction just to spin up. He thought the car was just getting totally slow and lazy, but he was actively paying a massive tax at the pump simply to overcome that totally unnecessary mechanical drag. He literally just needed to eliminate the invisible internal friction that was aggressively robbing his horsepower. But that internal drag is only the mechanical side of the raw loss. We also have to look directly at the specific airflow disruption causing your computer to violently overfuel the mixture. Modern vehicles rely completely on absolute airflow precision. If that airflow gets heavily restricted, your gas mileage completely drops off a cliff. And the absolute biggest killer of smooth, fast airflow comes directly from that exact same cheap engine oil vaporizing. If you talk to a chemical engineer, they call this volatility. When you heavily run a cheaper fluid, its chemical structure physically cannot handle the extreme thermal load, and it aggressively vaporizes into a heavy mist. Your engine block is a completely sealed system. To keep the massive pressure from blowing your gaskets out, the positive crankcase ventilation system actively sucks those hot, oily vapors straight out of the crankcase and routes them directly back into your intake manifold. Because almost every single modern vehicle uses direct fuel injection, there is no raw liquid gasoline constantly washing over the intake valves to keep them clean. So that hot, vaporized motor oil heavily hits the blazing, hot, dry metal of your intake valves and it instantly bakes. It physically cooks into thick, rock-hard carbon deposits. Over 40 or 50,000 miles, those carbon rocks build up so heavily that they physically choke the airflow going directly into the cylinders. Your engine literally cannot breathe. The computer reads the heavily restricted air, totally freaks out, and alters the injection parameters. The computer starts throwing totally random cylinder misfire codes. Guys spend hundreds of dollars throwing parts at a ghost, completely unaware that the actual root cause was simply the highly volatile fluid they chose. It couldn't take the heat, it vaporized, and it slowly choked the upper half of the motor. Before we get totally deep into the highly specific ways you are actively training your car to burn significantly more gas, drop a quick comment down below. Tell me exactly what city or state you are watching from today, and tell me exactly what specific car you are actively driving right now. I always look through them, because the specific geography and climate you live in completely changes the mechanical rules. A guy navigating the steep, heavily broken mountain roads in Colorado is putting a totally different thermal strain on his machinery than someone doing aggressive cold starts in the freezing dead of a Minnesota winter. The environment entirely dictates the wear and the efficiency. And if you actually appreciate getting honest, straightforward garage knowledge without the corporate gloss, do me a massive favor and hit that like button, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. It tells me you guys want real garage knowledge, and it pushes me to keep pulling the curtain back on the invisible stuff that heavily drains your wallet. We also have to look at the raw physical fuel you are actively buying at the pump. Fuel is highly volatile stuff. It evaporates incredibly easily. When it gets exposed to aggressive ambient heat or massive turbulence, part of that heavy liquid physically turns into completely useless vapor before it ever has a chance to hit your combustion chamber. When you are forcefully holding the gas pump handle completely wide open on a blazing hot afternoon, you are heavily churning that liquid. Warmer fuel is physically less dense. It possesses entirely less raw mechanical energy per liter. You are literally paying raw cash for heavy vapors that simply vent entirely out of the system, leaving you with noticeably less usable liquid gasoline. You are silently bleeding hard-earned money before you even turn the key in the ignition. Then, you actually get out on the highway, totally confident the heavy machinery is running perfectly because the dashboard is entirely quiet. The check engine light is going to stay completely dark. But deep inside the exhaust system, your oxygen sensors are heavily subjected to extreme, violent heat and raw carbon buildup every single time you drive. These massive, highly sensitive sensors do not just suddenly fail overnight. They suffer from a totally invisible mechanical flaw called sensor drift. The computer highly relies on those exact physical sensors to dictate exactly how much liquid fuel to violently spray into the block. When the sensor slowly drifts out of specification over thousands of miles, it reads the exhaust gases slightly wrong. The computer completely believes the sensor, and it aggressively enriches the fuel mixture. You are entirely losing efficiency, heavily burning through an extra tank of gas every single month, purely because of a slow, totally silent degradation that the computer physically refuses to flag. You have to completely understand that your fuel system operates under massive, highly stable physical pressure. If that raw pressure fluctuates even slightly, the entire injection timing completely alters. The physical combustion efficiency totally drops like a rock. What actively causes that highly destructive pressure drop? Usually, it is a driver aggressively ignoring the health of the electric motor sitting directly submerged entirely at the bottom of his plastic gas tank. That electric fuel pump physically uses the raw liquid gasoline as a heavy cooling jacket to keep from melting. When you totally run the tank down to absolute fumes, that pump is entirely exposed to the open air. It loses its liquid cooling jacket, and the electric motor heavily superheats. It physically struggles to maintain the massive pressure the engine entirely demands. The spray pattern out of the injectors turns from a fine, highly explosive mist into a sloppy, heavy drip. The engine completely fails to properly atomize the fuel, raw liquid gets entirely wasted, and your gas mileage violently drops. You are actively hammering your fuel system to death simply because you totally refuse to keep a quarter tank of gas in the machine. You are entirely forcing the heavy metal under your hood to fight a massive, totally unnecessary physical battle every single time the traffic light turns green, and your fuel economy absolutely tanks as a direct result. We left off talking about how your engine completely fights itself when you starve it of clean air and proper fluid pressure. But you have to realize that motor does not operate in a physical vacuum. It is heavily chained to the rest of your powertrain, and eventually, to the actual pavement. The absolute biggest parasite draining the life out of your engine and aggressively stealing your gas money is the heavy metal box sitting directly behind it, your automatic transmission. Most drivers treat their transmission like a magic black box. You pull the shifter into drive, the car goes forward, and you completely ignore it until the car physically refuses to shift on the highway. And the absolute biggest mechanical trap ever successfully sold on a dealership lot is the concept of lifetime fluid. You read the owner's manual on a lot of modern cars, and it actively tells you the transmission is totally sealed. It says the fluid never needs to be changed for the entire life of the vehicle. Let me translate exactly what lifetime means to a car manufacturer. It means the exact length of the factory warranty. Once you cross 60 or 70,000 miles, they do not care if that gearbox violently explodes because the repair bill is coming entirely out of your wallet. Transmission fluid is not just a heavy lubricant. It is a highly engineered hydraulic fluid. Your automatic transmission relies on absolute pinpoint hydraulic pressure to physically squeeze massive friction clutch packs together to change gears. Every single time that transmission shifts, those clutches slip just a tiny bit, generating extreme heat and shedding microscopic particles of heavy friction material straight into the fluid. Over time, that fluid severely degrades. The chemical additives completely burn off. It stops acting like a crisp, responsive hydraulic fluid and starts acting like a thin, dirty syrup. When the fluid loses its physical grip, the internal clutch packs start to slip. You might not even notice it at first. It just feels like a slight hesitation when you step on the gas to pass a truck. You get a tiny, split-second shudder. But here's exactly where it heavily destroys your fuel economy. When the transmission hesitates and slips, it completely alters the physical-mechanical load placed on the motor. The engine suddenly has to rev significantly higher and fight considerably harder just to maintain basic forward momentum. The computer sees the RPM spike without the corresponding wheel speed, and it instantly dumps extra fuel into the cylinders to compensate for the lost power. You are unknowingly forcing the engine to operate completely outside of its engineered power band. I had a guy tow a late-model SUV into the lot last year. He had 110,000 miles on the original transmission fluid because the manual confidently told him to leave it alone. The car had been getting absolutely terrible gas mileage for 6 months, and it started shuddering hard going up hills. Instead of fixing it, he just kept driving it until the transmission violently slammed into neutral on the interstate and completely lost all forward gear engagement. He was staring at a $4,000 rebuild for a heavy mechanical failure that could have been entirely prevented with a $200 fluid change a year earlier. Not to mention the hundreds of dollars he actively burned in wasted gasoline because his engine was constantly fighting a slipping gearbox. Have you ever actually drained the lifetime fluid out of a used car you bought? Let me know down in the comments what it actually looked like. I have pulled fluid out of sealed transmissions that looked and smelled exactly like burnt black coffee. Do not trust a piece of paper when it tells you to ignore a heavily working fluid. But even if your transmission is shifting perfectly, you might be actively training your car to burn massive amounts of extra fuel simply by how you turn the key in the morning. We need to talk about the absolute worst driving habit that completely tricks people into thinking they are taking perfect care of their car. The short trip. The 2-mile grocery run. You see the ads online all the time. A 10-year-old car with incredibly low miles. The owner swears it was just a grocery getter. It was only driven 2 miles down the road to the store and maybe 5 miles to church on Sundays. People fight over those cars. They pay a massive premium because they blindly think a car with 20,000 miles on it is practically brand new. Mechanically, that engine is completely suffocating, and its fuel economy is absolutely garbage. When you start an engine completely cold, the metal components haven't expanded to their proper operating tolerances yet. Because of that, a modern computer intentionally commands the engine to run incredibly rich. It aggressively dumps raw, extra liquid fuel directly into the cylinders just to keep the freezing cold engine from stalling out. If you get on the highway and drive for 20 or 30 minutes, your engine eventually hits perfect thermal equilibrium. The computer leans the mixture out and your fuel economy stabilizes. But if you only drive 2 miles to the grocery store, shut the car off, and drive 2 miles back, the engine never even gets close to operating temperature. The computer leaves the fuel injectors totally wide open the entire trip. You are literally getting single-digit miles to the gallon, and you are washing raw liquid gasoline directly past your piston rings, entirely diluting your engine oil. You are paying a massive premium at the pump to actively rust your motor from the inside out. Now, let's step completely out from under the hood and look directly underneath the chassis. Because you can have a perfectly running engine, fresh fluids, and a smart driving route, and you can still bleed money at the pump because of the only physical part of your entire vehicle that actually touches the asphalt. Most drivers think fuel economy is purely a calculation of how efficiently the engine burns gas. That is only half the physical equation. Fuel economy is entirely dictated by the total amount of raw mechanical energy required to keep thousands of pounds of heavy steel moving forward against the natural forces of gravity and friction. And the absolute biggest parasite violently draining that forward momentum is rolling resistance. I had a guy bring in a late model, naturally aspirated Japanese sedan a few weeks ago. The car was incredibly well kept. He handed me the keys and told me the car was suddenly getting absolutely terrible gas mileage. He used to easily hit 35 miles to the gallon on the highway, and over the last 2 months, it had aggressively dropped down to 26. He was completely convinced the engine was silently failing. He aggressively begged me to run a massive compression test and totally tear the fuel system apart. I didn't even plug the computer scanner into the dashboard. I simply walked over to his front wheel. The problem was completely obvious. He was driving a standard commuter crossover, but he had just bolted on a brand new set of incredibly aggressive, thick-tread, all-terrain tires. I asked him if he had suddenly started taking his daily commuter car out to muddy trails. He looked at me, totally confused, and said no. He just liked the way they looked. He thought it made his basic crossover look like a tough 4x4. He totally got the look he wanted, but he was actively paying a massive, recurring subscription fee at the gas pump for it. Those massive, chunky blocks of heavy rubber are engineered to violently dig into deep mud. But when you roll them down a perfectly smooth suburban highway, they turn into an absolute nightmare for your engine block. First, you have massive aerodynamic drag. The air physically gets trapped between those giant rubber blocks, creating totally unnecessary turbulence. You hear that loud, aggressive humming noise on the highway? That noise is raw acoustic energy, and your engine had to burn extra liquid fuel to physically generate it. But the absolute biggest killer is the physical weight. Aggressive tires have thickly reinforced sidewalls and massive amounts of extra compound. Most drivers totally fail to understand the massive mechanical difference between the weight sitting inside your trunk and the weight bolted directly to your wheel hubs. Engineers call this rotational mass. If you add just 10 extra pounds of heavy rubber to each of your 4 tires, your engine doesn't just have to carry that extra 40 pounds forward. It has to physically grab that heavy rubber and forcefully spin it from a dead stop. Adding 10 pounds of heavy rotational mass to a wheel puts the exact same mechanical strain on your powertrain as dumping 100 pounds of dead weight directly into your back seat. Your transmission has to shift much later. Your RPMs hang significantly higher. You are actively forcing the heavy metal to fight a totally unnecessary physical battle, and your wallet takes the direct hit. Are any of you guys running heavy all-terrains on a strictly street-driven car right now? Did you notice the massive drop on your gas gauge the second you left the tire shop? Be honest down in the comments, because the shops absolutely love selling these expensive upgrades. But they conveniently forget to mention you are going to lose 4 miles to the gallon instantly. Even if you totally avoid the heavy off-road rubber and buy standard street tires, you can still totally destroy their physical efficiency by ignoring the single most critical element holding the entire chassis off the ground: the raw air pressure. Most guys blindly rely on the little orange low tire pressure light on the dashboard to tell them when to grab an air hose. They assume if the light is dark, the pressure is perfectly fine. That is a massive, highly expensive misunderstanding. That TPMS light is a heavy safety warning designed to keep you from blowing a tire out at 80 miles an hour. It is not a highly sensitive fuel economy gauge. Federal regulations dictate that the computer doesn't even trigger that bright orange warning light until the tire has physically lost 25% of its recommended air pressure. Think about the absolute raw math on that. If your door sticker demands 35 psi, your tire can be sitting completely flat at 26 psi, and the dashboard stays totally dark. At 26 psi, the physical structural integrity of the tire totally collapses. The rubber massively sags. The contact patch heavily expands outward against the hot asphalt. The engine suddenly feels incredibly sluggish when you hit the gas pedal, because it is physically dragging 4 totally soft, heavily sagging rubber balloons down the interstate. You are forcing the engine to constantly push a piece of rubber uphill. You are burning hundreds of extra dollars a year in raw fuel simply because you refuse to buy a $5 mechanical air gauge and physically check the stems yourself. You can go out right now, physically fix your tire pressure, dump the cheap discount oil, get your transmission fluid completely flushed, and get back on the highway entirely expecting your gas mileage to magically shoot straight back up to factory specs. And you will be totally furious when it doesn't change at all. Why? Because you completely ignored the heavy brain actively running the entire operation. The computer sitting under your dashboard has a highly active memory. Engineers call this long-term fuel trims. When you drive around for 6 straight months with heavily sagging tires, a totally dirty intake system, and slowly failing oxygen sensors, your engine control unit physically adapts to that totally terrible mechanical reality. It actively writes a completely new, highly inefficient fuel map just to keep the car running under those specific garbage conditions. When you finally fix the physical hardware, the computer doesn't just instantly figure it out. It is still aggressively running that totally sloppy, gas-guzzling fuel map. It literally learned how to be terrible at its job, and your daily neglect actively trained it. To actually fix this, you have to perform a highly controlled reset. You either hook up a professional bi-directional scanner to actively clear the learned fuel trims straight back to factory zero, or you execute a manual driving pattern reset. You completely disconnect the heavy negative battery cable for 20 minutes to drain the internal capacitors. When you bolt it back up, the computer totally wipes its long-term memory. For the next 7 days, you drive that car incredibly smoothly. You maintain steady, conservative highway speeds. You completely avoid aggressive, violent throttle input. You are actively forcing the engine control unit to rewrite a highly efficient, perfectly leaned-out fuel map based strictly on the new, healthy physical reality of your engine components. You literally have to reprogram your own efficiency baseline from scratch. But even with a perfect computer, you have to actively look at the physical load you are forcing that computer to deal with. Let's talk about the absolute most ridiculous visual mistake guys make every single day that actively burns cold hard cash. You look at the roof of half the SUVs on the highway right now, and they have massive, heavy metal cargo baskets, totally empty roof boxes, and bulky ski racks permanently bolted to the top. The owner used that expensive rack exactly once for a weekend camping trip in July, and he just left it bolted up there for the next 2 years because he thinks it makes his basic commuter car look rugged and outdoorsy. At 70 miles an hour, aerodynamic drag is the single greatest physical force your engine has to violently fight. You are not just cutting cleanly through the air, you are forcefully pushing a heavy, square brick directly through a thick liquid. That totally empty metal basket is violently grabbing the air. Your engine has to physically generate massive amounts of extra torque simply to maintain a basic cruising speed. You are easily losing 2 to 3 entire miles per gallon every single day. You are completely throwing an extra tank of gas straight into the garbage every few months, entirely because you are too lazy to spend 5 minutes unbolting a piece of plastic from your roof rails. We also have to talk about the exact physical hardware sitting in your driveway, because a massive portion of you guys are actively driving cars with a totally hidden fuel economy trap bolted straight to the exhaust manifold. Small displacement turbo engines. Automakers heavily sold these tiny 1.5-liter and 2.0-liter turbos to the American public by aggressively promising V8 pulling power with 4-cylinder fuel economy. That is a massive, highly deceptive half-truth. When you stay completely out of the boost, driving like a grandma in the right lane, they get great gas mileage. But the absolute second you put a heavy foot on the gas pedal to merge onto the highway or aggressively pass a heavy truck, that tiny turbocharger violently spools up. It forces massive amounts of compressed air straight into the block. To keep the heavy metal pistons from physically melting down from the extreme, violent, localized heat, the computer immediately commands the fuel injectors to spray a massive, totally excessive amount of raw liquid gasoline directly into the cylinders. The computer is actively using your highly expensive premium gasoline as a physical coolant. If you drive a small turbo car aggressively, completely relying on the boost to get around town, you will easily get significantly worse gas mileage than a guy driving a naturally aspirated V8 pickup truck. You have to totally respect the raw physics of forced induction, or it will violently empty your wallet. Then we get to the absolute most expensive driving habit that literally puts mechanics kids through college. The turn up the radio fix. Drivers have a totally terrifying habit of completely ignoring early warning signs, blindly assuming the heavy machinery will just fix itself. You are sitting at a red light, and the engine feels like it has a very tiny, almost invisible stumble. You totally ignore it. You turn the music up and just assume you bought a bad batch of gas or the AC compressor's dragging. That little stumble is a microscopic misfire. A heavily worn spark plug or a completely carbon-fouled ignition coil is physically struggling to jump the electrical gap. Because the cylinder isn't firing perfectly, raw, unburned liquid gasoline is being pushed straight out of the exhaust valves and dumped directly into your catalytic converter. Catalytic converters are packed with rare earth metals that naturally operate at over 1,000 degrees. When raw, liquid fuel hits that blazing hot honeycomb structure, it acts exactly like an acetylene blowtorch. It physically melts the internal ceramic core. The converter completely collapses inside itself and plugs your exhaust pipe completely solid. the engine totally suffocates, and the car dies right there on the shoulder of the road. You completely ignored a $60 spark plug issue and actively turned it into a massive, mandatory $2,000 exhaust repair. And the entire time that plug was slowly failing, you were getting absolutely terrible gas mileage because the raw liquid fuel was just dumping straight out the tailpipe onto the asphalt. If you actually want to stop being a helpless victim to the gas pump and these totally devastating repair bills, you have to totally change the exact way you interact with the machine. The guys who confidently push their daily drivers past 200,000 miles without constantly burning extra fuel use a highly specific strategy. They don't wait for the car to physically brake. They don't sit around waiting for the computer to start screaming at them with a bright orange light. Once a month, they pop the hood. They pull the heavy oil dipstick, and they don't just look at the fluid level. They bring it right up to their nose and physically smell it. If that oil smells aggressively like raw gasoline, they know they have a massive fuel dilution problem. They know their engine is running way too rich, actively destroying their fuel economy and quietly eating their heavy main bearings alive. They catch the mechanical failure before it violently destroys the block. Every few months, they plug a cheap $20 digital OBD2 scanner right into the port underneath the dashboard. They do this even if the check engine light is entirely off. Why? Because modern computers store pending codes. The highly sensitive computer will physically detect a massive sensor drift, a failing oxygen sensor, or a slow transmission shift solenoid long before it actually decides to illuminate the dashboard and warn you. You can actively catch the invisible fuel leak while it is still just a minor $50 inconvenience, weeks before it actively leaves you stranded or burns through hundreds of dollars in entirely wasted gasoline. Fuel economy is not about finding one magical digital trick or pouring a highly expensive bottle of snake oil into your gas tank at the truck stop. It is an entire interconnected physical system. It is a strict system where raw physics, precise mechanical maintenance, and your exact daily driving behavior all interact constantly. Most drivers out on the road lose absolute fortunes over the lifespan of a vehicle, not because gas is inherently expensive, but because they are entirely blind to how this heavy machinery actually breathes and operates. You have to totally stop blindly reacting to broken parts. You start looking aggressively at the heavy internal heat, the hidden mechanical friction, and the violent aerodynamic drag you subject your car to, and you finally take total control of the machine. If this breakdown completely changed the exact way you look at the car sitting in your driveway right now, do me a massive favor and hit that subscribe button. Drop a quick comment below and tell me exactly what the worst gas mileage you ever got on a specific car was and what entirely caused it. I read through all of them, keep your fluids clean, and I will see you in the next one.